Tonight, Canada is remembering former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. The man who dominated politics in this country for almost a decade. Conservative, controversial, consequential.
We are doing it because it is right for Canada.
From Baie-Comeau to Parliament Hill, Mulroney shaped Canada and its place in the world. Tonight, those who supported him, opposed him, who reported on him, on his legacy.
I always tried to do what I thought would be right for Canada.
The policies, the man, and the leader.
From CBC News, this is The National with Ian Hennemanson.
We have extensive coverage for you tonight as Canadians across this country pay tribute to Brian Mulroney after news broke this evening Canada's 18th Prime Minister had died at the age of 84. Mulroney was one of the longest-serving leaders in Canadian history, guiding this country for 9 years. That time included unpopular policies, including the implementation of a federal sales tax. But when faced with backlash, he stood by his decisions, saying they were necessary for Canada. Mulroney's daughter says he died peacefully today while surrounded by family. And this is the Canadian flag on Parliament Hill, where Mulroney spent so many years. It has been lowered to half-mast and will stay that way until sunset on the day of Mulroney's funeral or memorial service. Tonight, you'll hear from those who knew Mulroney well from across the political spectrum. But let's begin with our chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton, who looks back on Mulroney's life, his time in office, and why he evoked such strong emotions.
His very first foray into politics to become leader of the Progressive Conservative Party brought him a bitter loss. He channeled that bitterness into another leadership run 7 years later. That time, he won handily and renewed the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada with the largest majority in Canadian history at the time. Brian Mulroney created deep loyalties with those around him in unifying the party. Some of those loyalties were later tested and lost. Mulroney came from the small town of Baie-Comeau on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River. Remote and isolated, he grew up in an Irish Catholic family, the son of an electrician at the local paper mill. But his ordinary upbringing was quickly overtaken by his extraordinary life. A close friendship with then U.S. President Ronald Reagan, what many saw as an attempt to change the relationship between Canada and the United States, and a first step towards a free trade agreement between the two countries, something Mulroney had initially opposed. In fact, free trade became the center point of Mulroney's pivotal second federal election in 1988.
Our message is clear. Canada is open for business again.
Bitterly fought, it became about Canadian patriotism.
You've sold us out. I happen to believe that once you...
Mr. Turner, just one second.
Once any
you
nation...
do not have a monopoly on patriotism. And I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian.
Mulroney won his second majority, leaving him lots of room to move forward with bold and potentially controversial ideas, including bringing in the much-disliked GST.
We are doing it because it is right for Canada. It must be done.
As a son of La Belle Province, Mulroney also made promises to recognize Quebec as a distinct society, and he sought to complete something his predecessor and political nemesis Pierre Trudeau failed to do: attempt to win Quebec's signature on Canada's repatriated constitution. That kicked off years of negotiations with the provinces, starting with the Meech Lake Accord. But as it moved towards ratification, some provincial governments had now changed and were suddenly no longer on board.
I believe it's about time that you allow the Aboriginal people to be heard.
A one-day meeting turned into a week-long, last-ditch effort to save the agreement that ultimately failed.
It's a sad day for Canada. This was all about Canada, about the unity of our country.
The disappointment turned to anger from some conservative Quebec MPs who left to form the Bloc Québécois, including one of Mulroney's close friends, Lucien Bouchard. Mulroney never forgave him. And Western Canadians, too, began to feel left out, leading Preston Manning to create the Reform Party, both leading to damaging splits within the Conservative movement down the road. Mulroney's second attempt to get Quebec to sign on to the Constitution came in the form of the Charlottetown Accord. It also failed in 1992 after being put to a referendum. It was the end of a quarter century of constitutional reform in this country, and it was more fodder for those who simply were ready to move on from the Mulroney era. Yet he still had work to do.
If there are not fundamental changes in South Africa, we are prepared to invoke total sanctions against that country and its repressive regime.
Pressuring international partners to denounce the apartheid in South Africa and free Nelson Mandela. It won Mulroney worldwide praise and a visit from a grateful and free Mandela just months after his release. Mulroney signed the Acid Rain Accord with the United States in 1991, earning him kudos from environmentalists. But Canada had wearied of Mulroney after turbulent years, and he left politics in 1993.
I always tried to do what I thought would be right for Canada in the long term, not what could be politically popular in the short term.
What followed was the start of a long Liberal reign. His successor, Kim Campbell, managed to win only 2 seats. His years after politics were marked with some embarrassing legal battles, including questions about his relationship with the German businessman Karl-Heinz Schreiber, resulting in an inquiry. Mulroney did admit to accepting $250,000 from Schreiber for consulting.
I was fighting for my life and the honor of my family.
The inquiry found the former Prime Minister's dealings with Schreiber were inappropriate and not ethical. Mulroney called it the worst mistake of his life and set to rebuild his reputation. Conservatives once again sought his counsel or his blessing, and the Liberal successor to his old foe, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, counted on his advice during negotiations around NAFTA 2.0. Even in the moments when Mulroney knew he was strongly disliked by many Canadians for his decisions, he believed strongly in why he was doing it.
In the fullness of time, history and a more reflective nation will tell us whether our hopes for the ultimate success of these policies were in fact realized.
Mulroney marked the history of this country time and time again, and now in his passing, Canadians may reflect on just how much he gave and how much he changed their country.
And Rosie, your thoughts on this night?
Brian Mulroney was a prime minister who wanted to make big changes, Ian, and some of them succeeded, like NAFTA, and others failed, like those constitutional reforms. What you will hear, I think, though, throughout tonight and the next number of days is about Brian Mulroney's humanity, that he cared about the people around him, that he cared about his own MPs, and that he sure liked to pick up the phone and call people. And once he picked up the phone and called you, you were stuck talking to him for quite some time. I'll give you 2 little personal anecdotes. One, when Ed Broadbent died about 6 weeks ago, I emailed him. He was not an emailer, he was a phone caller, and I asked if he would have some comments. He called me back immediately, even though at the time he was in hospital and struggling with his own health issues, and he made sure to find a quiet spot in the hospital so that he could pay tribute to his opponent. And I'll give you one more anecdote. Lucien Bouchard, the man who he was very upset with when he left and went off to form the Bloc Québécois, well, he was on Radio-Canada tonight, and he said that in the past 6 months, the 2 men had finally reconciled their friendship.
And Rosemary, you'll be back in a few minutes with a special At Issue. Chief Political Correspondent Rosemary Barton in Ottawa. Well, we're hearing so much reaction to Mulroney's death tonight from those who admired him, worked alongside him, and faced off against him. Rafi Bouchikanian takes us through some of those tributes.
Prime Minister, great to see you.
One of Brian Mulroney's oldest opponents, but Jean Chrétien revealed shouting across the political divide was years behind them.
We would tease each other. You will poke fun at me, I will poke fun at him. And, we will, as I say, we have to not to take ourselves too seriously. We have to take the job very seriously. We tend, when we talk privately like that, to talk about memories that we share. And as I said earlier, we have many coming from rural Quebec.
Not just home for them, but a key part in Mulroney's big bet in coming to power.
His greatest success was to break in Quebec. And it was was his argument when he ran, and it turned out to be right.
Prime Minister Trudeau, who saw Mulroney last summer at one of his last public events, also praised him and noted how he has relied on his advice far past when Mulroney held office.
He was incredibly generous and effective in advising me and our government on the renegotiation of NAFTA during some very challenging years, where not just the advice and strategic counsel he gave me and us, but also active with his contacts as part of Team Canada to make sure that the messages on how important the friendship and the relationship between Canada and the U.S. was, not just for Canada but the U.S., was key.
Mulroney also nurtured personal relationships, like with former Quebec Premier John Charest, who just visited him in Florida this weekend.
He was very weak, but already at that time he said to me, you know, I'm not sure I'm going to finish the year. And I tried to convince him of the contrary, telling him, listen, you know, this is the 40th anniversary of the election of his government. And that he had in front of him a number of events that we needed to organize to celebrate his legacy.
And from the Conservatives' current leader,
the lesson I take from Brian Mulroney is to always remember humble beginnings. He started as the son of an electrician in a working-class Baie-Comeau neighborhood. He worked like crazy to get himself a good education and pay his way through law school. But no matter how high he rose in politics, he remembered those humble beginnings. He remembered the struggle of his parents to put food on the table.
That legacy's importance echoed by Trudeau.
He shaped our past, but he shapes our present, and he will impact our future as well.
Rafi Bujikanian, CBC News, Ottawa.
Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper is also remembering Brian Mulroney. He wrote, "History will record that Mr. Mulroney's premiership was transformational. Canada has lost a historic figure, and we mourn his passing with all his many friends and associates." Oh, we saw Jean Charest in Rafi's story, elected in the Tories' landslide victory in 1984. Charest went on to serve in Mulroney's cabinet. He later led the Progressive Conservative Party himself and served as the Premier of Quebec. And Jean Charest joins us from Montreal tonight. Jean, thank you for speaking to us on this
Thank you, Ian.
difficult night for so many people. I want you to take us back to when you were a young cabinet minister working alongside Brian Mulroney. What was he like at that point in his career?
I was elected in '84. I was 26 years old. I had supported Joe Clark in the leadership race. And so the Mulroney clan and the nomination, they weren't favorable to my candidacy, but I got through. And then we got to know each other, and he took me under his wing. And I became a minister at a very young age. And I remember Ian very fondly that moment, because he asked me where my wife was, and he said to me, I would have never been Prime Minister of Canada without Mila. And I remember the gesture. He said, we're like this. And he asked me where my dad was, and because he had lost his dad at a very young age. And he was an extraordinary person in that respect. As a leader of a party, I don't think there's anyone who has reached the pinnacle that he reached as a leader of a party. As a prime minister, he was courageous, transformational for the country. And he lived in a period where he felt that governments and leaders had to make difficult decisions that were sometimes unpopular, carry them, defend them, and if you got the politics right, you would get through them. So he changed our country. He changed our lives. And those who served with him, all those who served with him, remember him very fondly.
And people, Jean, who may be too young to remember or maybe have not thought about it very much over the last few decades, tell us a bit about Mulroney's strength as a leader, because he created this coalition that included Conservatives from Quebec and from the West and ended up with that huge majority in the first election win.
His basic argument in the leadership race against Mr. Clark in 1983 was, how are you tired of losing? And we as a party need to be able to have support in Quebec, and I can deliver that. He delivered that in spades. He reached out to Quebec. The Meech Lake Accords were done for Canada, not just for Quebec. I mean, this perception, it was done for all of Canada because he felt we needed to fix this if we were going to go forward. And so in that respect, he was exceptional. And then as a party leader, he reached out to all of the country. You know, it was interesting, Ian, you'd go to a caucus meeting, and at the end of the mandate, I mean, we had been through a lot of difficult issues. Country was a bit worn out by all the debates. And he would, when he was in caucus, when he spoke to caucus, everyone would show up. That's how compelling he was. We'd walk out of that room, we were at 15% in the polls, and the media thought, you know, they looked at us, they thought, they must be on drugs. It's as though they're on 60% of the polls. But that's how powerful he was as a leader. And that allowed him to get a lot of things done. So in that respect, those who worked with him will forever remember an exceptional and a very generous man.
We have about a minute left. Of course, by the end of his time in politics, he left a depleted Conservative Party. You were part of that, just 2 seats in the House of Commons, and then you ended up becoming the leader of that party. I don't know what connection he had to you then, but as you look back at the highs and the lows of the Mulroney Conservatives, what would you say his legacy is?
Well, he did change the party. He had a very activist agenda and very transformational. And when he left power, admittedly, the government in the country was partly worn out. When I became leader of the party, he was very supportive of everything we did. I saw him last Saturday, and I had, I went to Florida because he wanted to chat, and I saw him Saturday. And I wanted, we talked about preparing events to celebrate his legacy of the last, because this is the 40th anniversary. And so I hope that'll happen this year, because there's a lot of good things to remember about Brian Mulroney and what he's done for us and what he's done for our country.
Jean Charest, a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
Well, let's bring in former CBC News chief correspondent and host of The National, Peter Mansbridge, who covered Brian Mulroney over the years many times. And Peter, first of all, some reflections on the former Prime Minister's passing.
Well, we knew that his health had been a challenge for him these last couple of years. The last time I was back and forth with him was just a couple of months ago. And, you know, he knew the difficulties he was facing, but he was convinced that he was going to power through. You know, unfortunately, these health issues took his time away from him today. Listen, he's a major figure on the Canadian political landscape. Was he without failures in his political life? No, not at all. I mean, there were some issues that haunted him a long time. But there were other things that put him on that landscape in a significant way. I mean, 2 majority governments, there are not a lot of prime ministers who can say they got 2 back-to-back majority governments, including the biggest one in Canadian history in 1984. He pushed through free trade. There was a divisive debate, but I think most people, not all, but most people argued that it helped establish Canada on an economic front in a different way, given the free trade successes. You know, the GST was something that was a problem in terms of selling it, but at the same time, it was something that future governments were greatly thankful for, including the Liberal government that followed the Mulroney era. But I think most significantly for him was on the world stage, was his pushing for South Africa and Nelson Mandela. He pushed Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan into accepting the idea of Mandela being released from jail and eventually the end of apartheid. That wasn't easy. That's never been forgotten by the South Africans. I was in South Africa at the time of the funeral for Nelson Mandela, and I'm telling you, Brian Mulroney was welcomed in South Africa as a hero.
You, of course, were there during the major political events for Brian Mulroney, including those 2 majority election wins, but you must have spent time with him away from the camera as a journalist. And I just wonder what you can tell us about Brian Mulroney as a person.
Well, the way he appeared sometimes on television was not the way you saw him in real life. He was a funny guy. He was he liked to kid around with journalists, and sometimes that bit him in the back because some journalists, respecting the rules of the game, reported some of the things he was saying, and that caused him problems. But he was a guy who never forgot his friends. I'll tell you a quick story. When his agriculture minister, John Wise, passed away, Mulroney was in China, not as prime minister. This was in his post-political days. I reached out to let him know because both he and I knew John Wise separately. And I wanted him to know that his minister had passed away. He arranged with the minister of the church that was conducting the funeral to have a call from him piped in without anybody else knowing in the church. Only the minister knew. And he regaled the audience in the way only Mulroney could with stories about John Wise. That's the kind of guy he was. He never forgot a friend. He never forgot a political ally. And he never forgot some of his political enemies either, reaching out and making friends with them over time. So listen, this was a guy who I said, you just have to mention the word Airbus, and people will know that there were problems on the Mulroney side too. But there were major accomplishments, and those shouldn't be forgotten in a guy who was on the landscape, political landscape of this country for a long time.
Peter, appreciate your recollections of the former Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Take care.
As we go to break, some images of Brian Mulroney throughout his life and career. Our coverage continues with a special ad issue, as well as a conversation with a man who knew him well, former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, when The National continues.